Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, trade volumes between India and Nigeria increased by almost 70% in the current financial year, reaching over $15 billion. Indian firms present in the country have become the second largest employer. Skipper IQ is just one of those firms, and we'll be speaking to the team about why this newfound friendship is changing the face of the country's private sector. And according to US President Joe Biden, America is all in when it comes to improving its economic footprint in Africa. But given the fierce competition from China and Russia, is the US's new lust for the continent too little too late? I'll be putting that question and more to Greg Swenson, the founding partner of investment firm Brick McAdam and the chairman of Republicans Overseas UK. Then later, we'll be looking back at some of the biggest business news stories of the week. But first, let's start the show with a story that continues to make headlines here in the UK and across the world. 2/3 of British consumers plan to reduce their non-essential spending in 2023 as the cost of living crisis bites. The study, which was published yesterday by KPMG, revealed that with essential costs like food, energy, fuel, mortgage or rent already being too high and a concern about how high they still may yet go, families are cutting back elsewhere. This dramatic change in consumer habits is likely to have a significant impact on the future GDP figures.
I know things are difficult at the moment for people up and down the country with inflation. Of course I get that. That's why we've put an enormous amount of support in place for people's energy bills. £900 this winter for a typical family. That gives you a demonstration that we care about this and we want to find a sensible way through on pay. But I think it's entirely right for me to stand here and say that we have treated everyone reasonably and fairly, and we'll continue to do that.
Well, earlier I was joined by our business correspondent Simon Pusey for more on this story. Simon, I suppose I should start by wishing you a Merry Christmas, particularly because there's very little festive cheer around at the moment. KPMG, they released some data this week suggesting that 2 out of 3 consumers are going to be changing their spending habits next year because of the cost of living crisis. Retail sales pretty poor in November, even though we had Black Friday. I think there is going to be lots of economic headaches in Rishi Sunak's in-train in 2023, isn't there?
Yeah, and inflation going up, and Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, saying things are going to get worse before they get better. So trying to brace people for probably more cuts to spend public spending and probably more tax rises. Of course, this all came about from the last government. Well, wasn't helped by the last government in terms of their mini budget, which really spooked the markets, and then that saw Liz Truss go. And then Jeremy Hunt set out his economic spending plans in November, which were pretty controversial, not quite as controversial as the previous Chancellor, but it included tax rises and a spending squeeze, and people saying, well, this wasn't our fault. Why are we paying for something that the last Conservative government got wrong? Labour saying that those measures caused economic carnage. And the next thing that we're looking out for is in March. So that's the next budget, where Jeremy Hunt's probably going to do a little more of the same, really. But you're right, there's a sort of smorgasbord of different things going on here. We've got cost of living and inflation, which is only going to get worse. Inflation expected to be 9.1% in 2022, dropping to 7.4% in 2023. So inflation
still way above 2%.
It's going, exactly. And that's why then we've got strikes at the moment, because public sector workers want their wages to go up in line with inflation. Of course they do. And then, of course, we've got Brexit and the British Chamber of Commerce saying that businesses are still grappling with this red tape that's been put in place very suddenly because of Brexit. And they're saying that Brexit may have reduced UK trade by about 7%. So there's a lot of things going on here for the government to try and grapple with and tackle. And, you know, strikes already, 8 months of strike action are thought to have cost the UK economy at least £1.7 billion. So from all angles, really, there's lots of things happening here. And then you've got the war in Ukraine, which is obviously of no fault really to anyone in the UK. So it's really hard to see how that this can get much better in the short term, at least. And I think that's why Jeremy Hunt is saying things will get worse before they get better. He's trying to prepare people for more economic pain. But yeah, it's very hard to see how the Conservatives can come out well from this. Remember, they've been in power for 12 years. So it's hard for them to blame the last Labour government like they do like to with the economy. They like to be thought of as fiscally responsible. So it's very, very tough for Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt to try and come out of this well, I think, in terms of public opinion.
How do you think, just briefly, Simon, the world is looking at Britain? I read a piece this week in the Wall Street Journal, and they were describing the strikes and saying, this is unprecedented. Biden, look at what's happening in Britain, because we don't want this to happen in our country. Do you think we're a laughing stock, especially because we had 3 prime ministers?
Yeah, I wouldn't say so. If you look at Europe, there's been strikes in Brussels and in France and in Germany, and this isn't just a UK-specific thing. I think the cost of living crisis and the squeeze.
It's a global story, isn't it?
I think certainly across Europe it is, and anyone who's affected by Russia and Ukraine in terms of food prices, energy prices, of course, are going to suffer. I think with things like Brexit, that does make us kind of unique in terms of no other country really has lost their biggest trading partner overnight, pretty much. And then you've got things like the last Conservative government and that sort of car crash of a budget. So I think we've got a lot more to sort of grapple with maybe than other countries. And also the Conservatives have been in for a long time now, and it's quite hard to sort of maintain. People are going to look elsewhere, and I think
Brexit too.
I think we already know that. I think we already know that there's probably going to be a Labour government next.
Yeah.
Unless the Conservatives somehow turn it around in the polls. So it's quite hard for them to sort of reinvent themselves, because the blame really lies squarely at their feet. They will say this is a global thing. They will say the cost of living is.
Yeah.
But it's quite hard in the terms of public opinion. So while I can understand why countries would look at, there's a lot of strikes going on here, I don't think it's just a UK specific thing.
Yes, well, we'll have that conversation this time next week, where it will be New Year. So it's just nice of me to now say Happy New Year to you, Simon.
Happy New Year, Julia.
Thank you. Let's change gear now to focus on a story that is likely to have positive implications for Africa's somewhat complex relationship with America. US President Joe Biden announced deals worth over $55 billion in trade and investment partnerships and deals at the recently held US-Africa Summit, which took place in Washington. That includes $11.5 billion to address HIV/AIDS, more than $2 billion to combat malaria, more than $2 billion in support of family planning and reproductive health, and another $2 billion to address the health, humanitarian and economic impacts of COVID-19. As another scramble for the continent is underway, the summit has been seen as a US attempt to reassert its influence in Africa to counter Chinese involvement. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by the founding partner of investment firm Brigg Macadam and the chairman of Republicans Overseas, Greg Swenson. Greg joins me from Vienna in Austria. Greg Swenson, as always, it's a pleasure to have you on Channel's Business Global. Joe Biden insists that the US is all in when it comes to investing in Africa's future. Given the fact that China, Russia, Europe are all over the continent, do you think it's too little too late, or is there still plenty to gain?
Well, plenty to gain, Juliana. It's never too little too late. This has been going on for a number of years. Actually, the Trump administration, specifically Mike Pompeo, as the State Department, led the charge, and I think there was a few administrations, both Republican and Democrat, that were asleep at the switch, or the State Department was asleep at the switch as China was expanding their economic footprint in sub-Saharan Africa. But that all changed a few years ago, and I'm good for the Biden administration for formalizing that with the Africa Leadership Summit and a couple of initiatives that came out of that. So it's really good news, and I'm really happy to see it.
It's interesting that you mentioned Donald Trump's regime and Mike Pompeo, because according to some on the continent, Donald Trump was pretty dismissive of Africa. I won't even dare repeat what he said about our president, Muhammadu Buhari, but there were also some other gaffes about Africa and our leaders and the continent as a whole. Again, I can't repeat them because some of the words were expletives. Right. I think America has kind of found itself in the same place as Britain, where it's kind of like, we don't want that colonial relationship. Things have changed. Right. If we're going to do a deal, we got to be equal partners on the table.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I think, as usual, the president's language was often clumsy, but in terms of what he actually did, the USDFC doubled their balance sheet. A lot of that had to, ended up being supportive of African initiatives and investment in the region. So, I think that started with Secretary of State Pompeo and has continued now with the Biden administration. So I think it's formalizing it, which is great, but it's not new. And so I think the idea and the hope is that they'll just continue the investment the long-term investment in the region. And that's not just, economically, but also, with training and with economic uplift for the region, not just for the U.S. investment community.
What are some of the economic headwinds facing Biden and the administration?
Well, surely there's the inflation problem is even if it's improving, it's surely not going away. You've got the factor, the denominator factor, the base factor, they call it, the CPI, all these inflation numbers that are coming out are based on a year ago numbers where those were inflated. You had, 5, 6, 7% inflation toward the end of or the middle of 2021. So it's reflecting higher prices overall. That's really hurting the consumer. If you look at the necessary, the absolute necessities, housing costs, groceries, fuel for your car, those are up 16% year over year. So, I think we're going to see some headwinds from the consumer, and that's 2/3 of the U.S. economy. So, that's probably the leading charge. And I think, the continued hostility to the private sector, specifically on energy, is really hurting the economy. Inflation can only be fixed by, liberating the supply side, which is not going to happen, as well as decreasing the demand side. And so you're seeing that with higher interest rates from the Fed. So, obviously inflation and the Fed's hawkish policies, perhaps long overdue, but I think they're going to stick with it. So you're going to see some real headwinds for the economy in the U.S.
Greg Swenson, founding partner, Brigg McAdam, Happy New Year to you, and thanks so much for joining me on the show. Now, before we head to the break, let's return to a story which dominated headlines in the final quarter of this year, the deadly protests which have rocked Iran. According to the Norway-based Iran Human Rights Group, at least 100 people have now been sentenced to death or charged with capital offences in connection with the demonstrations in the country. They erupted following the death in custody of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old woman who was detained by morality police in Tehran on the 13th of September for allegedly wearing her hijab or headscarf improperly. Authorities have portrayed the protests as foreign-backed riots and responded with lethal force. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by Negin Shiragahi, a former broadcaster and women's rights activist. Negin joins me from Stockholm in Sweden. Negin Kutunayi, thank you so much for joining me back on Channels Business Global. I didn't want to end the year without returning to the story in Iran. It is a huge topic. And of course, since the protests began in September, we are hearing that over 400 protesters have died, including, sadly, those that have been executed. What is the latest you're hearing from family, friends and colleagues on the ground?
So the protest still is going on. It might not be as massive and extended as the start or like a month ago, but what is happening is the resistance still is quite alive in the country. But now we have another wave of economic situation that is hitting the country, and the currency of the country plunged within the last 2 weeks. It's a massive burden on the government, and at the same time, people are still going out to protest and using the rituals of the death, the 40th day after the death, and other rituals that exist in the country to show their protest. And that's why in different parts of the country, you're seeing these protests going on, but not in a traditional taking to the streets. At the same time, the verdicts of some of these, you pointed to the executions and imprisonments are coming out, and we are seeing more and more sentences for executions. But there's a massive campaign to stop that, and the civil society is trying a lot to just stop that kind of verdicts.
It is so much bigger, and there are so many. It's such a complex set of circumstances, but we know peace is pretty simple, isn't it? Pretty simple to attain if you want it. Such A pleasure speaking with you, Negin Kutanai, former broadcaster, human rights activist. It's only left for me to wish you a happy new year, happier times, hopefully, for the people of Iran, and we shall speak to you again soon. Thank you, Negin. Coming up on Channel's Business Global, I'll be examining the robust economic trade partnership between Nigeria and India, which increased almost 70% year on year, and we'll be looking back at some of the biggest business news stories of the week. All of this after the break. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. In a moment, I'll be examining the robust economic trade partnership between Nigeria and India. But until then, here's Teniola Oyetayo with a breakdown of the biggest business news stories of the week. From December the 31st, the popular messaging platform WhatsApp will cease to function on 49 phones, including the iPhone 5 and several Android handsets. As new and updated versions of gadgets are released each year, WhatsApp bosses have said these older phones will be unable to support the app anymore. WhatsApp is among the most popular messaging apps in the world, with the company boasting more than 2 billion users in more than 180 countries. Britain's Trade Union Congress warns that further strikes could lie ahead in 2023 unless the government enters talks with union over wages. The TUC's new General Secretary, Paul Nowak, accuses the government of stonewalling pay negotiations. The government says it can't afford to give in to workers' demands of inflation-busting pay rises and is refusing to negotiate. ExxonMobil has launched a legal challenge against the EU in a bid to force it to scrap its new windfall tax on oil groups. The US oil giant accuses Brussels of exceeding its legal authority, calling the measure counterproductive. The EU windfall tax, announced in September to tackle high energy prices, gives the bloc the authority to place a 33% levy on energy company profits for 2022. Teniola Oyetayo for Channel's Business Global. Thanks, Tenny. Now for our final topic. Recent data released by the National Bureau of Statistics has revealed that trade volumes between Nigeria and India reached $15 billion between 2021 and 2022, marking a nearly 70% increase from the previous financial period. Presently, India is Nigeria's largest trading partner, and similarly, Nigeria is India's largest trading partner on the continent. According to the website of the Indian High Commission in Abuja, there are several prominent Indian firms contributing significant corporate social responsibility to Nigerian communities, with these companies the second largest private sector employer across the country. The Skipper IQ Specialist Eye Hospital is just one of them.
Merry Christmas!
I'm an ophthalmologist, a second-generation ophthalmologist. My father also was an ophthalmologist, a professor in medical college, and it happened he served here even in Nigeria way back in 1976 to 81. And as a child, I used to come here. And in India, I started a chain of eye hospital by the name of IQ. And Jitendra Sachdev, the group president of Skipper Group, is a very old friend of mine, and so it was around 2016. We were just chatting about how to, do new health, some new programs in health overseas, and that's how I came in contact with him. And Nigeria immediately struck me because I've been here, I know this place, and this is something which I feel will be a great economy in the next coming 4 or 5 years. So why not be and contribute with such an economy? That's why Nigeria.
India and Nigeria are natural partners. India is a giant in Africa. You have the largest population, largest GDP of Africa. And India is also a very large population, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilinguistic, exactly like Nigeria. We have been natural partners, and we have been cooperating almost in all areas. I can tell you that India recognized Nigeria as an independent country. Actually, 2 years before your independence, we had set up our representative office in Lagos. So that is the depth of our relationship. Our political relationship is wonderful. Our economic relationship is great. Our healthcare relationship is good. People-to-people contact is fantastic. We have more than 135 Indian companies with more than 90 $17 billion investments in Nigeria. Anecdotally, we say that Indian companies are the largest employer after the Nigerian government. So we have a very strong relationship, and we are especially proud to have our Indian entrepreneurs venture into new areas, and particularly in healthcare. And I'm very happy that Skipper is starting its third hospital for ophthalmology, super specialty hospital here in Abuja. India is really proud to be partnering with Nigeria in the health sector. As you know, India is one of the favorite destinations for Nigerians to go for the best healthcare that is available at an affordable price. And we are also very happy that we can replicate some of them over here. As I was mentioning, there are few hospitals which have come up mostly in the ophthalmology side, and also the Primus Hospital which is there. And with more support, I believe that we would be having more and more cooperation in the health sector, so that there would be good health for our friends in Nigeria.
If we have facilities that are available here, and we have trainings for our own doctors, and then people would be encouraged to stay back and actually get value for their money as patients, and the doctors will get value for servicing these patients. So it's very important that we have that structure on ground. Partnering with Indians, here in Skipper, we have that advantage because our own grown doctors get extra training from the Indians, and that way we can retain our knowledge and pass it down to other colleagues that are willing to learn, and it's very important because when you know the theory and you don't get the practical, you're like half-baked, but when you get all the skills, you're able to transfer knowledge and everybody is happy. So at the end of the day, if the Indians in code decide to leave, at least we can transfer this knowledge. So it's quite important that they're doing that for us, which is very commendable.
Our 24-25 goal is to treat at least 50,000 surgeries, to do the 50,000 surgeries, as well as at least we should be seeing almost 1 million patients, and at least we will be able to eradicate 3% of the blindness from the 3% of the population.
So many African people or the patients, they move towards the India to get the treatment because they need to get the cheaper treatment, and that too in the world-class treatment, which should be benefit to them. But these services from the India, we have brought it here itself, so people can get benefited from this hospital. And it's a very long chain in the India as well as in the Nigeria as well.
But government is excellent. There's no problem. We have the certification from the Ministry of Health, the connection with the Ministry of Health. Anytime we have required, we have not seen any problem. So the things have been smooth, and they have been very well with the government interface. It's very special because this is a flagship. This is the biggest. This has special VIP wings. It has a special eyewear areas, and it has very special state-of-the-art modular OTs. So this is going to be I will say it's going to be a Moorfield of Nigeria.
Infrastructure and equipment will never form any hospital. So the top them up is the best is we have doctors who are competent enough to use all those machines and technology and give a true and the right treatment to our patients. So that is something different. And not only doctors, our paramedical staff, they are trained we give them training, soft skill trainings and other trainings also. Even for the doctor, there are few doctors who are expats, but most of my staff and most of my doctors are from Nigeria. We take them to India, we train them there, and that is all hands-on, and they learn the surgeries, and now then they come back and they are doing the surgeries here. So this is something unique about this group.
Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today. But as always, do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week and next year for more in-depth business analysis on Channels Business Global. Happy New Year to you.